You can pause the recording. All right, good evening. This is Scott Wersing. There's three of us here at the UDU's Tri-Center listening in. We'll do introduction starting here, and then I'll call on people to that are online to introduce yourselves, and then we'll end up with Guy, who will start his presentation. My name is Scott Wersing, Director of Programs for ISBI. I'm an instructional design specialist for the Coast Guard and Training Center, Yorktown.
Hi everyone, my name is Bernd Hase. I'm a guest board member at large. I'm an executive coach and leadership developer for the private industry.
Hi everybody, I'm Stephanie Shipman. I lead our leadership development and professional skills training at my company, PRA. Been with the ISBI since '93.
Go to Erwin. I'm just going to go down the participant list.
Hi, I'm Erwin Jankovic. I'm on the board of ISBI SoCal. Spent most of my career at Boeing and the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. Had arguments with Gary Rumler about some things back in the 80s, late 80s, and looking forward to Guy's talk.
Brenda.
Hi, good evening. I'm Brenda Struble, formerly Brenda Melly, back when I served on the board for ISPI Central Florida, back when we had a chapter. Currently an ISD instructional systems designer for a company called Solaris Research Group, and we do a lot of Department of Defense contracts. I'm currently on a Marines project, was on Navy projects before that. So nice to see everyone.
Great. Now this list just jumps around. Brian. Brian, you're on mute. All right, we'll come back to Brian.
Lisa's ready, she's off mute.
Okay, Lisa, you're off mute. Introduce yourself.
Hey everybody, greetings from Michigan, guys. So glad to see you. Got me to join at the last minute when I remembered you were speaking tonight. So I'm a past president at the international level for ISPI back around 2013, 2014, and a past Michigan president, and currently at my day job at Innovative Learning Group. I'm the owner and CEO there, and we're celebrating 20 years in business. So lots to be grateful for this holiday season. Good to see you all.
Thanks. Jeff Puryear, want to introduce yourself?
Well, I'm trying. There we go. Hey, I'm Jeff Puryear. I'm from Brunswick, Georgia. I guess I belong to the ISPI chapter up in Atlanta. I am a senior instructor and a program coordinator for the U.S. Army down at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Georgia.
Great. Mary, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. I am Mary Combs, formerly Mary Addison, and I am a ISPI member. It's been a minute. Sound like it's been a minute. So I am currently an external evaluator for a consulting firm in Chesapeake, Virginia. The name is Quality Measures, LLC. And we are external evaluators and evaluate programs and projects for a lot of universities, mainly HBCUs who are trying to improve the initiatives in STEM. But we'd also evaluate community-based organizations and faith-based organizations as well. And I am happy to be here.
Joanna, want to introduce yourself?
Hi, Joanna Wooten. I'm with Janus Research Group in the Hampton Roads, Virginia area. And currently working on a Coast Guard project at Main Street Towers in downtown Norfolk. A couple different projects there.
Great. Anybody I missed? Jeff, we didn't hear you. Mark Bowers, you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, I do. I'm Mark Bowers. I am a 2 or 3 times removed past president of the Hampton Roads ISPI chapter. I currently do a lot of volunteering at the ISPI global level. I was chapter partnership committee chair for a while, then awards committee chair for a while. Now I'm kind of a geek volunteer at large, supporting some automation development as well as trying to resurrect a little bit of the history of ISPI in the awards department since 1962. So, as Guy mentioned, kind of like Gary Romler, I have failed miserably at retirement, except for the part about not getting paid anymore. So that's me.
All right, anybody else who would like to introduce themselves that has not? All right, we'll give it over to.
Did you hand it over to me? You cut out.
It's you. I'm going on mute here so we can chat in the room without bothering everybody else. But can you present or share your desktop? Do we give you that? Mark should have given you that permission.
Yeah, I'm gonna do that here.
Okay.
Can you see that? The first slide?
Not yet. I just made you a co-host just to make sure you got permissions.
Okay. Maybe I need to redo this here. It says my screen sharing is paused. Is that me or you guys?
I think that's on you.
Uh-oh.
We can see you started screen sharing, but doing a poor job of it.
Okay, let's see here.
What it says on our screen is double click to enter full screen mode.
I think that's more about us as viewers. There we go. You're
All right, very good. Sorry, operator error. I'm an old guy now, and so that's just how it is. All right. So this is about a derivative of a derivative of a derivative of a method for performance and gap analysis based on the derivative of a derivative that I was taught way back in 1979. So everybody set the Wayback Machine to August 6th, 1979. And I'm in my first day on the job out of college. I'd gotten a radio, TV, film degree at the University of Kansas. And I drove a quarter of the way, I guess, across the country to Saginaw, Michigan, to the headquarters of Wix Lumber. I'd been working for them as a part-time inside salesperson my last 2.5 years of college. And on that day, I was given 3 things to start reading and to begin my development, other than the coaching I was getting from my boss and my coworker, who were only 2 weeks into the job themselves. They had been found via one of the other people in our 10-person training services group, who happened to be Gary Rumler's brother-in-law. And these 2 people that I was going to work side by side with had just come from Blue Cross Blue Shield of Detroit, Michigan, where they had worked with Gary Rumler's brother. And so I was inundated, oriented to dunk deeply into the stuff of Gary Rumler and his business partner up until just a year or so before, Tom Gilbert. And on my first day, I was given a Praxis newsletter. Now, Praxis was the consulting firm of Gary Rumler and Tom Gilbert from the late 60s to the late 70s. And this newsletter was from 1970, and it had one article in it, and it was on guidance, the short way home. Well, 9 years later, when I'm reading this, guidance is already known as job aids, more popularly known as job aids. And so I was told by these 2 people that I'd gone to work with that's what we were going to do. We were going to do job aids. We weren't going to do training because, why expect people to memorize everything when it's impossible and they can't do it. So we were just going to do job aids. And that's what we did in our very first project, and our clients hated it. And so we did sneaky trick number 47, and we embedded job aids into the training to make our client happy and the learners, otherwise known as performers, more performance competent immediately. The second thing I was given that first day was Bob Mager, or Robert F. Mager, and Peter Pipe's book from 1970 as well, Analyzing Performance Problems, or You Really Oughta Wanna. And this has this famous flow diagram diagnostic tool to help you determine whether or not knowledge and skills has got anything to do with a performance problem. Because I was learning that it was just as important to avoid doing training when it wasn't going to have any impact at all. And it would be better to point to the client to, what the root cause or probable causes of their problem was. So I like to think that, training requests for new hires should be expected, and training requests for solving performance problems should be suspected. And we'll get into that a little bit later. The third thing I was given was this book from 1 year before, 1978, Tom Gilbert's book, Human Competence. And so here's where we begin. What do you mean, don't begin in the middle? Yeah, begin with the end in mind. Well, yeah, don't begin with knowledge or skills or behaviors or competencies. Begin with the performance outputs and tasks that meet stakeholder requirements. And that's then going to lead to desired outcomes, good outcomes versus poor outcomes or bad outcomes. So one of the things before I got through that book, which was a really tough read because it was very academic oriented and I was not, in that book, Tom Gilbert kind of bemoaned the cult of behaviors. I'm wearing a t-shirt right now that says the cult of performance in learning and development. But he was worried about the cult of behaviors, where the focus was on the means without clarity about the ends. And so that's how I was oriented on day one. And I worked with these two people for 2 years and got hammered into me this performance orientation. And I was told at the time that we were going to be doing a derivative of the performance analysis methodologies of a guy named Gary Rumler, and I didn't know who the heck he was. First things first here. So what I'm sharing with you has worked in my context. I worked for Wix Lumber, then I worked for Motorola, then I became a consultant a few years later in 1982, and I did that for 40 some years. And I've been doing this all my entire career, adopting what I could and adapting and even rejecting the rest. And so you should feel free to do that as well. I've had to change things that I learned from others to make them fit, to retrofit them into my assemblage of methods and processes and language and all of that. And so you're going to have to do that too. That's just how it works, right? All right, so this is a lot of blah, blah, blah about me, and that's not important. You can read that later on. You do not have to take any copious notes in this session. This presentation as a PowerPoint show will be available on my blog at 8:15 this evening, local time. What's more important is this list here. These were my 83 clients as a consultant from 82 to 23. And the only thing that's important here is if you kind of scan them and look at them, you'll see that it's a multitude of industries, because what I learned is industry agnostic. It works everywhere, and it can work for instructional architecture or instructional development projects. I like the term instruction. I've kind of gone full circle back to instruction because it encompasses both job aids or performance guides, whatever you want to call them, or training and learning experiences. They're all instructional if they're really any good at all, especially in an enterprise context, which is the context that I've been working in. This is me back in 1982 with my mentor. You can probably figure out who is who in the picture. We were at my boss's office in Phoenix. I worked out of the Chicago offices of Motorola. And Gary Rumler, I had met him at an NSPI, now ISPI, conference in 1980 in Dallas. I was introduced to him because he knew the two people that I was working with side by side. And then I went to work at Motorola because my wife got transferred from Saginaw to Chicagoland. And so I moved to Chicago and got a job with Motorola. And I got my job at Motorola because his name was on my resume, because I was a practitioner of his methods, don't you know? And so I got the invitation to come to work for Motorola, Motorola's Training and Education Center, the forerunner of Motorola University. And the good doctor was my consultant, which, as the joke went, meant that I carried his pencils around as we went from my client's site to the next site to the next site to the next site. And I got a chance to work with him on half a dozen formal projects, and every other project that I have that he wasn't being paid for, I got to ask him a lot of questions and get guidance from him on those as well. He was a great friend and a great mentor. So at the end of my first week back in August 1979, before Motorola, I was given a binder that had Praxis workshop materials from 1972 in them, and this was on page 404. The first thing Performance Incorporated does in making a performance analysis is determine and describe the ideal or desired performance of the employees or job in question. So we're either looking at, what's our current best in the current state, or what's the aspirational performance we want to get to. Nobody's there yet, but we got to get to that. So what's that? And this was very meaningful to me. So they do not start by describing all the activity, sometimes known as tasks or steps, that the employees engage in, but rather by identifying the major accomplishments or outputs, the results of the activity of the job. Now, I'm only reading this to you because maybe somebody's looking at this on a smartphone and they can't read the thing, so excuse me for doing that. But so the important thing here is accomplishments. That was Gilbert's term, accomplishments, for those of you who know anything about Tom Gilbert, the late Tom Gilbert, sometimes known as the father of human performance technology. And boy, wasn't that a controversy when that was started in the mid-90s. But outputs was the term, the phrase that Gary Rumler used. Now, Gilbert was a student of B.F. Skinner's, and Rumler was a degreed engineer from the University of Michigan, and he thought and acted and saw things as an engineer would, as a systems engineer, and not necessarily a bench engineer. But so the whole thing here is about looking at the accomplishments or outputs, and I've used the term outputs for the most part, the results, beginning with the end in mind, the results, not the activities, but that. And then they go on to say, then performance requirements, expectations, or standards for each output are identified and recorded. So how do you know a good output from a bad one? And then next, the actual performance is compared to the desired, thereby identifying areas that require further analysis and action. So they've not even done task analysis yet, let alone what are the enabling knowledge and skills. They're focused on what's that output from the flurry of activity or tasks with the process and all the rest of it. What's that output? What's that beginning? So, none of this back in 1979 when I saw this was new to the followers of Rumler, Gilbert, Magert, and Harless, and hundreds more. All of the people that were either thought leaders or followers of those thought leaders back at NSPI back in the day. So I've been a card-carrying member of NSPI/ISPI since September 1979, when I joined the Michigan Society for Instructional Technology, now known as the Detroit chapter of ISPI. But back in the day, we were instructional technologists, ITers, until Management Information Systems, MIS, decided they wanted the IT label, and we got bumped. And then we've been wandering in the woods ever since. So this is my kind of definition of performance competence. I could have called it performance capabilities, performance something or else. You know, there's a lot of different language here, and this has been a huge issue in our business, especially for new people coming in trying to figure it all out. But I use the word competence because of Gilbert. So, you know, again, adapt or adopt, you know, whatever you need to do to fit it into your world. But that's the ability to perform tasks, to produce outputs to stakeholder requirements. And what I like about this, I came to this language, this phrasing, maybe about a dozen, 15 years ago. But this works at the individual level. People are performance competent when they can do that stuff, or the process is competent when they can do that stuff, or the enterprise and the value chain that the enterprise sits in. So I can use this as my lens to look at, you know, what do we want? Well, we want people performing tasks, not knowing stuff. They need to be able to perform and produce. And it's got to meet those stakeholder requirements, those standards, those measures, et cetera. So that begs the question as to who the heck are these stakeholders? Well, this is from a 1993 article that I wrote about balancing conflicting stakeholder requirements. My client, General Dynamics in Fort Worth, where they built the F-16 and other fighter aircraft for the Air Force and the Navy. They were arguing about things, and you know, they had a poster on the wall, you know, about the customer is king. And my customer was running around going, the customer is king, the customer is king. And I hated it because that's not right. And so I wrote, so I was at my hotel room in Fort Worth, and I was writing this article that I got published, whatever, you know, almost a year later, because that's how things worked back then. And I decided to come up with this hierarchy because the customer is not king, not if the government says, here's the regulations, you violate these things, we throw all you executives in jail and fine your company into the dust and we'll close you down. So I don't care what your customer wants or demands. They're not the king. And so the customer is not king was the title, and the publication made it the subtitle. But so I came up with this to say, well, is there a hierarchy? You know, when you have conflicts, and this was funny because at General Dynamics, they had conflicts between the customers and the regulators as to, you know, what was allowed or what was required. And so this was hard for people. And so I said, well, you got to, you know, structure this hierarchy. This is an example for illustrative purposes are the weasel words down in the bottom corner of that stakeholder hierarchy. But you've got to, for your own situation, you've got to assemble, you know, so is there, does a union go in here as well? You know, what is my situation? And who sits on top of who, and who gets to, you know, reverse other people's desires, requirements, wants, you know, needs, whatever. And so in my picture here, the customer kind of leads in defining what those outputs should be and what the requirements are going to be. But hold on there, because management, executives, boards of director, owners and shareholders, the government, the society at large might countervene that. And so that's just something that's got to be taken into consideration when you're beginning with the end in mind and you're trying to figure out the output that's produced as a widget. And how do you know a good one from a bad one? You better be taking the stakeholders into consideration, because they are the ones, whether you like it or not, who get to set what those measures and standards are. Now, I do 4 types of analysis in all of my performance-based instructional architecture or development projects, ISD or LXD, depending on, you know, where you're at and what language you use. And instruction always includes both performance guides, otherwise known as job aids or performance support, and learning experiences, otherwise known as training, which sometimes has a bad name, or, you know, we're not supposed to use training anymore because we train dogs, but I always say to people, tell that to the Marines. All right, so this is about performance analysis. It's not the target audience analysis, which gets started at the very beginning, and you can't finish it until you understand what performance is in the scope of what we're doing, and does everybody in the target audience have to do that, or some people only have to do part of that, or what, how does that work? And then you can use the performance analysis to systematically derive the knowledge and skills that enable performance. And then what's always been important to me is I always want to assess existing content to see what I can reuse as is or after modification. So my methods, my context are doing this kind of stuff, and performance analysis fits in that there. This is my adaptation because as I told you, I do a lot of that. And this is my ADDIE-like framework, project management framework, because it certainly isn't a design model, but it's a project planning and management framework for my instructional development projects. And I always start off with a project plan and kickoff meeting with stakeholders. We do analysis, then design. We do development and acquisition of content using stuff as is or after modification, and building brand new stuff, whatever's required. And then I've extracted pilot test out of the development phase, if you will, because I always wanted to make a big deal about that. That's the major milestone where the client's going to finally see something. And I would always tell them, we're going to do a full destructive test there. We're going to break that baby if we can, because we want to break it before we release it and have people use it. Because if it's not, any good, we should fix it first. So that's what we're gearing up towards, and we're in a hurry. So, help resource us and get us there. So the performance and gap analysis is reviewed at what I borrowed the term and the concept from the total quality management movement back in the early 80s, but a formal gate review meeting where the gate is either closed and we don't get to go any further until somebody opens up the gate and says, go forth and do good. And so that's an upside down stoplight because it's really a go light. So I didn't make a mistake in that, and I've been doing that for a long time, and there's only a few people that ever catch that. But so that there at that gate review meeting is what I call the L&D pivot point. Well, I always take the project, the client has a request for training, and I always salute and say, yes, we'll get right on that. And I don't challenge them. And I wrote a book about this a couple of years ago, and I believe in take the order for L&D, but make sure your L&D order fulfillment process includes an adequate analysis. Now, back in 1983 and 1985, the late Joe Harless spoke about this and wrote about this. And in the 85 NSPI conference, wherever it was, he was up on the stage and he said, when a client comes to you and asks you to help them with some training, do not respond in your whiniest voice. Are you sure it's a training problem? He was getting sick and tired of hearing people talk about, don't be an order taker. And here we are all these years later, and you see that same noise going on. If you're a support organization in an enterprise and you got a L&D or some other name on the door, your job is to support and enable other people's departments or processes or whatever and help the people working in that to perform. And until you have some data that's both valid and credible, you don't know whether you got a knowledge and skill deficit or not. So I believe you take that order, you don't push back, you don't challenge the customer back in the intake process when they make the request. You clarify the request, and then you plan a project and you kick it off and you conduct the analysis. And when you get to the pivot point here, that's when you can inform the client's business decision making as to whether to continue with an L&D effort, to pivot to some non-instructional effort, which is what we used to call it back in the day, or to do both. And so this is really critical. And I do a lot of pushing back in social media about all these people who kind of berate the order takers. Well, yeah, if you're not, if you don't have a good analysis process and you go from intake to development acquisition and skip all the rest of the stuff, yeah, what the problem is your L&D order fulfillment process, otherwise known as ADDIE or SAM or something else, is inadequate and isn't doing you probably any good at all. So when I was at Motorola in 1981, I saw the Ishikawa diagram, which was created by Professor Ishikawa in Japan in the 1950s as part of Japan coming out of World War II and trying to improve the quality of stuff, because we all knew back in the day that if it said made in Japan on it, it was junk, and they needed to change that. And so I saw the Ishikawa diagram, and it had the 4 M's. It had the process box, and it had 4 M's on the spine of the fishbone. Very non-politically correct, but it was men, materials, methods, and machines. And I thought to myself, well, other than that men box, which is the human part of the process, that was the environment that I keep on hearing people talk about, the environment. And other than Gilbert's behavior engineering model in that human competence book, um, there wasn't much. He didn't really detail out what included the environment. So I started learning stuff about the total quality management movement, because at Motorola, my clients were manufacturing, materials, and purchasing, and that's what they were all about. And so I began to build earlier versions of this, what's now called the Epi fishbone. But Rumler and Dale Breathauer, had the General Systems model. They both called the thing differently. And I asked Gary, why was that? And I said, who created it? You or Dale? And he said, well, Dale was holding the pen at the flip chart when we created the thing. So he says, your guess is as good as mine. And so there's many other models for this, but so this is kind of the diagnostic tool. This is my mental model as I look at performance. I want to know, what are the inputs? What's the process? What's the output? That begin with the end in mind, the output, the downstream receiving systems and processes. Who gets that output? That output is an input elsewhere. And we're getting inputs from upstream. And, so anyway, so I needed to think about things in a kind of a systems engineering, systems thinking manner before the fifth discipline came along. And also so this was just my model. So there's 12 variables in my model. And some of you will count it and go, there's only 11. But I learned something from Gary Rumler in that he always started with the process itself. So that's the first variable I would go to. Then he would go to the consequence system. All right, so that's kind of covered in my book, but it's really all about when I'm getting to that pivot point, I want to tell the client, here's what we've discovered about your process that we would do training on or learning on or instruction on. And here's if this was oriented because it's new hires, well, duh, yeah, but there may still be gaps in the current state. And we need to teach the new people how to deal with the barriers to performance, because master performers have likely figured that out. They know how to avoid barriers in the first place and what to do if they were unavoidable in the second place. And so this is still very important to me to do the performance and gap analysis, regardless of what caused the project to be started in the first place. Traditional data generation and reviews, we do individual interviews, observations, and document reviews. In 1979, out of frustration, I started using what I call a facilitated group process. And when I became a consultant, that's what my firm did, the consulting firm that I joined. I was asked to start a training practice area, and my two consulting business partners and we all did a facility. We brought together groups of master performers. My clients at Motorola said exemplars, which was Gilbert's term. They said that we hate that word, guy. That's a $30 college word. We hate it. I said, how about master performer? And years later, I discovered in my metal file cabinets an article by Dale Breathauer that used the phrase master performers. So that's where I stole it from. And so I had adopted it without even knowing its source. So I started, bringing people together, master performers and other subject matter experts, to help me gather the data. But regardless of how you generate this data, and you might use a blend of those methods, it's all about the data's validity and credibility. Now, I've had valid data in a binder at Motorola thrown across the room by my main client, the manufacturing council, with 30 other people and their other manufacturing operations managers because of the names that I had on the cover of the analysis report, because I had what I later learned to call the Friends of Training, who were always available to help us out in the training world, but they had no credibility with my customers and the higher ups in the management chain. And so it's got to be valid and credible. So your sourcing is important. So accuracy, completeness, and appropriateness is really key. Completeness is always an issue. We'll get to that a little bit later. So pro tip, have your clients and stakeholders handpick your sources for interviews, observations, document reviews, or handpick people to be in your version of a facilitated group process, a T group, if you will. And pro tip number 2 is have them tell you who not to talk to, what not to observe, where not to observe, and what documents to avoid because they ain't no good. So we're moving into now, how do I gather this data, how do I capture it? So I use the same format for data capture and data reporting. Here's a group in my conference room back in the either late 90s or in 2000. This was a group from Verizon, just after Bell Atlantic had merged with GTE and became Verizon. And these are the double wide flip chart pages on the wall of the conference room. And I want to draw your attention to the one in the center on the left there. You can see that there's one column that's kind of filled out and all the rest of them are blank. And the other charts that you can see, they've got stuff all over the place. Oh, also, my rule was always that neatness does not count, legibility does. And this is that format that we use. So the first thing to do is for each area performance, and we'll get into this in a little bit, but area performance is like major duties, accomplishments, key results areas. It's a chunking thing. ADDIE is an A, a D, and an I, and an E, and those are chunks. And we don't have to get into whether that's waterfall or not. But so for every chunk of performance, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4, depending on what you're looking at, we want to identify that, and we want to identify, well, so what are the outputs and what are the measures? How do you know a good one from a bad one? What are the key tasks? Who is doing what when we're doing those tasks? Is it just one job title? Is it people handing things off back and forth? Are they collaborating together at the same time? How does this work? And who's involved? Because that's important when you're training or educating or helping people learn, who does what to produce those outputs. How's that work? All the time or some of the time, and what are the variances of all that? And so that's ideal performance to me, the outputs, the tasks, and the roles and responsibilities. And then I want to talk about the typical performance gaps. Now, I may want to look at the atypical performance gaps if it's nuclear power and we could blow, Detroit off the face of the earth. And so that ain't no good. So we want to go beyond, just typical. We want to know everything under the sun and not just on every 37 blue moons. But then we want to either get the probable gap causes or the root gap causes. Usually I'm doing this in a meeting. I don't have time to ask why 5 times and everything that comes up and use other diagnostic tools and methods to get to the real root cause. I just want to know off the tops of the heads of the master performers and other subject matter experts I'm facilitating, why do they think we have this typical performance gaps, which is all started when we can identify outputs that typically don't meet the measures and standards. So that's where those typical performance gaps from, and then we can say, well, why is that? What's the probable gap cause? And of course, just because you can bring a group of master performers and other subject matter experts to consensus does not make them right. But who else would you start with? And from there, we can identify, well, that gap cause is that, down at the bottom right, is that a deficiency of the process, a deficiency of the environment, a deficiency of the individual's knowledge and skill, or is that a deficiency of some other individual attribute and value? So I've changed the DE kind of thing that came out of Gilbert's. It was a deficiency of execution versus a DK, deficiency of knowledge. So that was one of my adaptations. Like I said, I do a lot of that. And that's gap performance there. So that's what we're talking about here. So this is from a project back in the mid 80s for sales, a sales rep. I've changed the wording a little bit to take out whatever was client specific, but this was part of the area performance territory planning before we go off and make up a whole bunch of sales calls and drive back and forth between Indiana, Michigan, and Illinois, 17 times when we should have stuck in one state and done all the work there and then moved on to the next state because that's more efficient. But anyway, so there's the outputs and the measures are, and I don't quibble with master performers when I ask them, so how do you know a good or bad one? I just write down what they say, and then I turn to the group and I do face polling, and I tell them I'm doing that. If you're bold enough to answer my question, I write it down without questioning it, and then I turn back to the group in its entirety, and I look at everybody's faces to see if they agree with me, and I ask them, please help me. Nod your heads up and down if you believe that this is true, accurate, and you're affirming that, or shake your heads sideways if you don't agree with what I wrote down, and if you're really not sure, shake your head diagonally, and that kind of laugh. And then here's the task, and here's who's doing what, and we can either put an X in the various roles. You can see the role table down at the bottom: sales rep, support, sales manager, sales VP, and that's ideal performance. And then we can say, well, okay, so the plan is incomplete or not updated quarterly when needed, and the probable gap causes are they don't know how, or they don't take the time, or it's not even demanded by management. So there's a DK, a DE, and a DE. And, what are you going to do if management doesn't demand that? So I could turn to my clients and say, hey, this may or may not be a training problem, but even if we train people on it, your people aren't even asking for it. So why are we bothering with this? Is this really important? And if it is, maybe you managers, you executives on my project steering team, maybe you should do something about this because, maybe we need to train them, but it's probably more about the consequence system and the processes I learned from Rumler. So that's the gap performance portion of that. So back to my fishbone. So what do humans bring to the performance party? Well, they bring awareness, knowledge, and skills. They bring physical attributes. Maybe they need to be able to load 50-pound bags into the back of pickup trucks all day long. And so there's a physical requirement besides the awareness, knowledge, and skills. Maybe there's a psychological attribute here. Maybe you got to be able to deal with a world chock full of ambiguity, and it's different every single moment of every single day, and there's no predicting anything. And how do you like them apples? Square peg in a round hole, or maybe you are the round peg and they're a perfect fit for that job because you thrive on that kind of stuff, whereas other people hate it. So what do we know about the psychological attribute requirements that the human needs to bring to the performance party, or the intellectual attributes? Maybe we need somebody who can be a switch hitter and do concrete thinking and strategic thinking, conceptual thinking, and switch hit back and forth all day long because that's what their job requires. Or maybe they need to have certain personal values and be able to deal with people from other cultures and such. And so, some people just aren't really a good fit. And so what does the human bring to the performance party? If we're in L&D, we can deal with awareness, knowledge, and skills, but sometimes I've helped my clients uncover the fact that they've got people who aren't really a good fit for the job otherwise. And investing in developing them, training them, helping them learn is squandering shareholder equity, and that ain't no good. And in the environment, so the data and information, materials, supplies, tools and equipment, facilities and grounds, budget and head count, culture and consequence. And as I've said before, Gary Rumler taught me, the first thing I look for is the process. Is there one? If there is, are people adhering to it? Yes or no? If not, why not? And then he would look at the consequence system to see if the consequence system was inadvertently driving the wrong behaviors. And I'll be darned if you didn't find that out all of the time. that the master performers would tell you they learned to ignore the consequence system. Even if their boss was pushing them to do something, they would go their own way and get it done and get it done right because nobody was going to fire them because they're at the top. They were master performers and they knew it, and they didn't tolerate fools, even if they had to work for them. So we look at ideal performance, we're looking at inputs, process and outputs, we're gaps, we're looking at all of it, everything. So I'm not going to undo the screen here. And so Scott or Mark or somebody, are there questions in the chat? I'm not looking at the chat.
No, why, your model, your fishbone diagram, why do you have human enablers above environmental enablers?
Because human, yeah, I get that question all the time here, because Rumler said he would give the humans the benefit of the doubt and not even look at anything about them until he had uncovered everything else. But humans sit in an environment, and I kind of do a counterclockwise move from going process to the environment and then up to the humans. But you know, it may be one of the adaptations you need to make because that would communicate better in your context.
When you do analysis, where is it 50-50 on where the barriers are, or you don't really know, or you really don't?
No, most of the barriers. I lost a $700,000 instructional development project for a rather large company because all my analysis data showed them that training wasn't their issue. Knowledge and skills weren't the deficit. It was the environment. It was all sorts of stuff from people that were handpicked by the project steering team. And so I was reviewing all the data with them, and they said, "Oh, Guy, can you go down to the cafeteria and get yourself a coffee?" And I said, "Yeah, I can see where you guys probably want to talk about this because I'm not sure that it's the right thing to continue with this project that you've given me." And because all the data suggests that if you address the knowledge and skills, you're not going to change the problems that you were trying to solve. And so they excused me, and then somebody came and fetched me and brought me back. And they said, "Well, we're going to put this project on hold. We're going to fix these DEs, as you call them. We're going to put some critical action teams together and get on those things. And then we're going to bring you back and have you finish the project." And I said, "Really? Because the knowledge and skills aren't your problem." They go, "Well, yeah, we didn't mention this earlier, but we're gonna triple the size of the workforce here because we're gonna grow this part of the business. And so we're gonna have a whole bunch of new people coming in. And so we don't want to develop training for them when we're going to then have to update it all here. But so we're going to bring you in early and we're going to start on the things that we fixed first, and we're going to slog through this in parallel with fixing things and then training people on the fixed processes, et cetera. And then there's going to be some things that we can't resolve. It's not within our power. The return on investment isn't there. And as Guy had said to them earlier, um, even if you don't solve these deficiencies of environment, you need to teach performers to expect them and how to deal with them and how to avoid them if they can and what to do if it's unavoidable. What are the recovery strategies and tactics of the master performers? Because you've got some, and they can tell you, "Well, I avoid it this way, but if I can't avoid it, this is what I got to do. This is plan A, plan B, plan C." But anyway, sorry. Are there any other questions? So this is Q&A, one of three. There'll be one at the very end, and we can go further. Shall I continue? I'm not hearing, so.
Yep, keep going. No other questions. We'll come back to them next.
All right, very good. All right, so establishing these areas of performance, depending on the scope of your project, you may have one or many areas of performance. In my context, I dealt with big strategic issues, big high stakes performance where the risks and rewards were high, not medium, not low, where it was complex. So they were bigger things. I wasn't doing, micro learning, one little module at a time. So so it was always necessary to kind of chunk this out here before you dive deep. So these are the questions that I would ask about the area performance or major duty or key results area. Another pro tip, whatever your client is already using, yeah, use that. Don't introduce new stuff that now you're unclear. Is that the same or is that different? You're calling it the and these other people are calling it the. Is that the same? Come on. No, use what's already there and unless it just gets in the way. And I've had clients who said, well, we call these things key results areas, Guy, but what you've described about areas of performance, we like that better for some reason. So I would always take the lead of the master performers that I was working with when I'm in a facilitated group process. So what are the major phases or steps? What are the major chunks? How can this job be broken up logically into multiple segments? I mean, you can take the proverbial elephant and divide it into 3 chunks, 5 chunks, or 7 chunks, and it all adds up to the same element. So there are better ways of chunking out performance than others, but it's most of the time it doesn't really matter. I could have chunked it into 7, and Scott could have chunked it out into 5, and it all adds up to the same thing. And so, that's okay. The goal here is because these chunks or accomplishments or major duties or key results areas, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a performance model chart on each one of them. And so what's really important here is minimizing the gaps and the overlaps between them. If I'm going to look at that elephant, I certainly don't want to miss, a major chunk of the elephant because that might be, really critical. And if it's not critical, we can decide that later and go chunk C or 3. We're going to skip that because, that's low hanging fruit and it's not really important and all of that. And that's a client decision, because if they've given me a scope and I've, said, hey, there's 8 chunks of this thing, and they might go, number 3 is, we don't want you to address that. So drop that guy. And of course, I would salute and carry on. So this is your first application exercise of the evening. There'll be one more, a short one here. This one I'm going to give you 90 seconds to do. And I want you to define the areas of performance or whatever you like to call it for a kid job that you had back in the day. And I just want you to chunk it out and minimize gaps and overlaps. And so if we can start, I want you to do that. I want you to write things into the chat, and then I'm going to look at the chat to see what you might come up with. So please indulge me and give this a little bit of a try, and then we'll talk about what you learned in attempting to do that. Imagine, if you will, Jeopardy music in the background. So if you were to take a job that you had in the past, what are the chunks of that job? I was a newspaper boy back in the day. I had to bag the papers. I had to ride them over to my route. I had to deliver them. And then on Fridays, I had to collect money. 4 chunks. Ah, the dishwasher one, yes. We should all be able to relate to that. All right, time's up. So the important part of this is that now some of you got into, how do you tell a good one from a bad one? But I don't start with that. I really simply just go into what are the chunks so that I can get agreement on them. And then we come along and determine what are the measures for that. Gather tools, ladder placement, climb ladder, clean gutters, check work. Yes. So let me move on here. What questions do you have about that establishing the areas of performance? And if you don't have any, we can move on and cover everything at the very end of this. Scott, are you seeing any?
No, nothing here. Do you, in the performance area, do you ask about the standards or the conditions for the stakeholders in that, or not really?
Well, I'm going to get into this in a little bit here, but yeah, so you really, yeah, let me just move on here and we'll come back and see what your questions might be. All right, so when I've trained people on this, and I've trained people at Amoco and Eli Lilly and General Motors and AT&T and Hewlett Packard over the decades, I would tell the people in the workshops that I did that these are my questions. These are guys' questions. When we get into the application exercise, the practice with feedback, after, we give you information, then I'm going to do a demonstration of what that looks like, and then you're going to do it too. But these are my questions, and I forbid you to use my questions when you're doing a group facilitation to do analysis. And the reason I would do that is because I've learned through the School of Hard Knocks that sometimes the questions that I asked just didn't resonate with the people that I was asking. And I had to have more than one way to ask these questions to elicit this data: areas of performance, outputs produced, output measures standards, the task performed, and the roles and responsibilities. And what I learned was that most people don't think about what they produce. It's easier for them to think about what tasks they perform. But most people, because this is usually a training initiative or a learning initiative, they think about knowledge and skills. Well, you got to know this, you got to know that. No, 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 no. We don't want any of that right now. We want to know what you use that knowledge for and what tasks you perform, but what outputs are you going to produce, going back to that thing that was on page 404 of the Praxis workshop materials. So these are the questions that I would use for part one. And of course, this is the ideal performance, whether that's current state, the best of the best. We got people that are doing this. We want everybody else to be performing like them, or we want to do even better. We have aspirational goals to do even better than what we were doing now. And so then they were kind of doing a future state that hasn't been proven that it can be done, because when we're dealing with master performers and we're trying to get everybody up closer to their levels of performance, well, it's already been proven that they can do it because we got people that are doing it. But if it's aspirational and beyond that, we don't know if it's real, our aspirational goals to perform even better. And so, but that's what we're trying to do. And if you're doing the aspirational thing, that just takes a lot longer to get that out, because that takes a lot of deep thinking by the current state master performers, who have to break their own paradigms to even begin to imagine how they might be doing it better than they currently are. And so this is really kind of all about, the process part there, what's in red. And the output measures, to Scott's question, is that, yeah, so the measures or metrics that can be applied to the output that reflect all of the stakeholder requirements. We're back to, your mental model has to be, I got this stakeholder hierarchy here. And so I got to know, what's the customer want? What do the employees want? What does management want? What do the regulators want? And how many dang regulators are there messing in our world, And so, and what's a union want, So all of that kind of has to be taken into consideration as we're looking for outputs in the performance. So the output measures, what measures and metrics can be applied. We really need to know, begin with the end in mind. That's the output, and then what's required before we get into tasks. Now, then the part two is, so what's the gaps? what's, given the outputs, measures, and standards, and I can tell you that most of the time there aren't formal standards that are articulated. I've had projects where they were, but most of the time they have not been. But the master performers themselves know what the standards are. They've not been written down. They're not part of the formal stuff of the enterprise, but master performers know how they are judged because their egos demand that they know that and that they meet those standards each and every time, because master performers have big egos and they don't want to ever be seen as slackers. So that's why I ask for the master performers, and they're a tough crowd to deal with. Yeah, and facilitating them when you don't know much about their real world. They gotta warm up to you. You've got to, make some sense for them, but they know how their world of work is measured. And maybe nobody's asked them before, or they've been asked, but they didn't see any reason to share that. But I'll tell you, in a room full of other master performers where somebody breaks free and gives me something, the others have to join in because they've got to show that they too are master performers and know how things are measured in the real world. And now it becomes a little bit competitive. And so I use that with them. Um, and so facilitating them can be tough sledding, as the saying goes. And but I think that's so valuable. And my clients have that sit in the back of the room, in the cry room, not interrupting us, not interrupting the master performers and correcting them, because after all, they're the master performers and their manager isn't. They may think they know a lot about the performance, but they're not there at ground zero doing it, getting it done on the front line. And so the measures and standards, I can elicit those things. And I want those things because if I'm going to have practice exercises in eventual training, I want them to be authentic, and I want to replicate, duplicate. I want to use real work if I can, or last week's real work if I need to, or some simulated version of the real work. And I need to know it's not about just, uh, using your interpersonal skills, which might be necessary, but that's all a means to the ends. What are we trying to get people to produce? Are they supposed to, audit a loan application? Are they supposed to create a script? What's the output here? And how do you know a good one from a bad one? And that's tricky because master performers have created their own, informally. They're out there doing that informal learning thing, and they figured it out this themselves. And they may have their own language, which doesn't match up with the master performer sitting next to them. And maybe they consider it kind of, my professional thing here, and it's what makes me good. Why would I want to share it with everybody else? But so again, it's kind of tricky. But so once you get that done, you can ask, so are we always getting that? Or, with the other people, not you master performers, but the non-master performers, are they always producing outputs that meet those measures and standards? Or are they, which ones are typically not being met? And then we can get into, so what do you think the cause is? Is it the process itself? They're following the standard process, and you guys know that that's no good, so you never follow the standard process. Or is it some environmental support here? And, I had one person tell the room full of people, I always have trouble getting the current data, and I need the current data, and the people that are supposed to give me the current data are always late. So, Guy, this is what I do. I go into their office and I go stand on that person's desk. Yeah, I use their side chair. I get up and I stand on their desk until they give me the damn information that I want. They give it to me, and then I leave. And the next week I come back and they know that I'm going to stand on their desk, so they have it ready for me. And, people go, oh, wow. Okay, so that's what master performers have to do to deal with an inadequate environment. They find ways to get it done, and they don't let anybody get in their way. An extreme example, of course, but then you don't want to train people to do that, but it always made a funny story in the training. And so is it a knowledge and skill? They just don't know. Bob Mager used to joke, and it's not politically correct, but if you held a gun to their head, could they do it? Because if they could, then you don't have a knowledge and skill deficit. You have a motivation problem. And so we don't talk about guns anymore because that's, not politically correct. But basically, that's the same concept. Could they do it if they really had to, or they can't because they just don't know? Or, is that a deficiency in the individual attributes and values because we've got a poorly selected performer who lacks the physical or psychological or intellectual or the personal values that are needed? And that's dealing with the gap performance, and that's dealing with mostly these environmental things, except for, as Rumler always said, the first thing I do is go look at the process, and is there one? And if there is, are people adhering to it? And if not, why not? And then I look at the consequence system because we may be rewarding people or punishing people for doing the right work. We give our best performers more work than anybody else, and pretty soon, because they're smart people, they figure that out and they slack off unless there's, some benefit, some consequence in it for them. So the culture may need to be unscrewed up. So an example here, developing a script, I went to work in my first job and I developed scripts. I did analyses and I developed scripts. And I would always train people, when you're doing this, you get a chunk of the performance, you get an agreement on that. Developing a script is a chunk of the performance. So how do you know when you're done? What's the final output? And I've had to train people on, okay, so you can ask for outputs all day long and people look at you and they don't know what the heck you're talking about. And then you move over to the task column and you say, give me a task. When you're developing a script, what's one task you do? I don't care if it's at the beginning, the middle, or end. And I put it in the middle, and then I go upstream and then downstream and fill out the tasks. And eventually somebody says, well, then we write the final script. And you go, oh, isn't that the output? And they go, oh, that's what you want. Okay, yeah. Okay, so the script, yeah, that's the output. Okay, duh. And so I usually try to start off with, how do we know when we're done? What's the final output? And then I want to know if there's interim outputs. Interim outputs. Well, yeah, there's a draft script guy. Geez. And before that, well, yeah, we do a script treatment. And yeah, here's the tasks that go with that. And so that's pretty much it. You do a treatment, then you do a draft, and then you finalize it, and voila, you're done. And the measures are quality, quantity, and cost. Kind of or you use the layman's terms, the master performance terms for that. But then once you nail down the outputs and their measures, you go for the tasks, unless you get stymied, and then you go for the tasks. And you will uncover an output, and then the whole group will go, we get it now. Okay, we can play. And then we can say, okay, what are the roles? Well, down at the bottom there in the roles, I've got client and script writer. Okay, so who's doing what? We could put X's there, or we can use my coding. It's kind of like a RACI thing, but I've created this thing before RACI was more popularly known. So who executes the task? Well, the scriptwriter does in that first one. Review the interview notes. The scriptwriter does that. They execute the task. If it all goes wrong, who do we execute is the joke. Again, non-politically correct. Sorry about that. But so people give input to, or they execute the task, or they support the person who's got the E, they get the S, or they review and provide feedback, but they can't approve or reject. They can just give you feedback, or they get the A, they can approve, reject it, make you do it all over again because they don't like it. So that's how we clarify the responsibilities of roles in doing this. And then we can ask for, well, when do we get outputs that don't meet those measures? Well, treatments are not even done. Oh, well, the client's direction is to skip that step because they don't see any value in it. Oh, so that's a deficiency of the environment for the performer, the potential learner in the future. That's a deficiency in their environment. The client says, don't do that. Well, no, they're just not being strong enough and pushing back on the client and say, we got to do that. But the person might know that their management isn't going to back them back at learning and development. And so they're going to say, hey, just skip the treatment. And so why argue with the client? And so is it a DE? Is it a DI? Whatever it is, it's not necessarily knowledge and skill deficit in my example here. So we may have said, okay, leave the individual out of it. It's a deficiency environment. Management needs to take care of this, and our learning and development managers and leaders should go tell clients, we're going to do treatments here because what we've learned is that if we don't do a treatment, we're going to do 17 drafts of the script and we're going to be late on your project. So let's just do the treatment here and be done with it. It's only 1 page long. And so the client might go, okay, well, I don't like it, but I'll do it. So developing a script could be one thing in a chain of activities where you're getting an assignment, planning a project, creating an interview guide, conducting interviews, developing a script, create a storyboard, create a video production plan, go shoot that video, and then produce and distribute the video. This is what I used to do back in my first job. Exercise 2 is kind of a mental thing here. Some of you already did this in the previous exercise. Identify one output you produced. And I didn't talk about tangible versus intangible outputs. Tangible outputs, I was told, back in August of 1979, Guy, it's the thing, the output is the thing on your desk when you go home at night and you're going to come back in the morning and work on it some more. And I would go, oh, okay. So that's a tangible output, a physical, kickable kind of an output. Yeah, that's it. All right, but there's these other intangible outputs, the decisions you make. When you did that script treatment, that output, you had to do some decisions about how many characters were you going to have in that 47, 7, or 2. Because, we have to hire the actors for this thing, so 2 is better than 47. And so you had to make some decisions here about what was really necessary while you were creating that tangible output. So the output column, if you were really to go whole hog on it, would have both tangible and intangible outputs. And then you would identify what are the key measures in terms of quality, quantity, cost, or better, faster, and cheaper. How is that measured? And then you can list some of the tasks and you can identify who's involved with that. So I'm not going to have you do this and then look at what you were doing, but this was just a little exercise in your mind as you're driving home or shutting down your computer at the end of this session here. Think about a kid job that you had, because they're simpler and not as complex as the real world, and you're the master of that and nobody else knows. But you would, in my training for people on doing this thing, you would work on a kid job and you would then decide what are those chunks, the areas of performance, what are the key outputs, what are the key measures, what did I get yelled at when I was a kid, and what was important to the boss or whoever was yelling at me, and what are the tasks that I had to perform, and who else was involved. Was I doing these things solo? Was I doing this with somebody else? Did I have to check in with the manager, supervisor, or somebody else as part of getting that output produced? And then we could look at, so what are the typically not met measures? And again, situationally, contextually, if you're dealing with, high risk performance where people can die, then we don't maybe just want just what's typical. We want to know what's typical and atypical. Every 13 blue moons. Yeah, we want those too. Doesn't happen very often, but, we need to get prepared for that. We need to train Guy to, be aware that that could be, his turn to face that. And then we would identify the probable causes or the root causes if we have the time and it's really, really critical. And we can identify the types then. I see the chat has popped into my thing here. Somebody's got a question. So this is where you adapt or adopt, so the thing that the derivative of the derivative that I learned, we called it a performance table. And it was different than this. And I was trying to get both ideal performance and gap performance on one page for at least one or more outputs, whether an area of performance required 5 pages to describe all the outputs and all of those things. But if you remember the chart with the people sitting in front of it from Verizon in my conference room, they had a chart that went just tasks, because it was page 2 of an output that to produce that output had a whole bunch of tasks, and that spilled over into another page. And sometimes you don't have typical deficiencies and probable gap causes. You don't force that unless you really, really need to. But if you're doing the analysis, and this is one of your analysis outputs, when you get into design, you can embellish this data with real data additionally, you're layering it on. My process isn't a waterfall thing where, hey, we're done with analysis, we'll never touch that again. No, in design, we're doing analysis. Hell, we were doing analysis when we did project planning and kickoff. When we were doing the intake process, we were doing analysis. And now we're going to do analysis in development, and we're going to do analysis in pilot testing. And when we do the final revision and release, yeah, we're still doing analysis because it's the glue that holds everything together. So we do the performance model and we gather that data. It's all about the data, however you assemble it or whatever. It's just got to be valid and credible. And then you can use that to systematically derive the enabling knowledge and skills. This is where this goes to in my methods, in my context. And then that data, those two sets of data inform the development of a learning and development path, which I've been doing since 1981. I did my first one at Motorola. And then I did it as a consultant. I've done 76 of those things for my clients, and sometimes there was more than one path produced in a project. So I've produced about 125 learning and development paths, performance-based learning and development paths. And I also use this to design the learning and development event. Yeah, learning's not an event, but you know, we administrate at the event level. Event is like a book, and lessons are like chapters, and so lessons are the subset of events. It's a modular event. It's a modular lesson, and in the lesson there's information and demonstration and application exercises, the practice with feedback that's authentic for near transfer, because I hate far transfer. I hate going to training and then it feels like it's for somebody else's job. Yeah, that's far transfer. Cognitive task analysis. Professor Richard E. Clark, he likes to be known as Dick Clark, Professor Emeritus from the University of Southern California, has been working with others, Ken Yates is another one, on cognitive task analysis. And what the data shows is that when you're dealing with an expert or even a non-expert, all of us, we've automated and made non-conscious 70% of what a novice needs to perform. So if we are doing analysis and single sourcing it, which is what our industry does, our profession does, we get an SME, subject matter expert, emphasis on the subject matter, not on the performance, unfortunately. And we ask them and they tell us, and what the research shows us, that they can only share with us 30% of what they actually know to do when they're making decisions and doing the behavioral tasks, the observable stuff that we can see, we can count, we measure. The thinking tasks we can't see, we can't count, we can't measure. And that's all part of the task analysis, the behavior and the cognitive tasks. But when we single source things, we only get 30% at best. And if we talk to another expert and they give us something that's overlaps but is a little bit different, the good news is that every expert has automated a different 70%. So if we talk to Dick Clark says, 5, 6 people, we're going to get, 85% plus. And that's going to be mostly the real critical stuff. And then if we do alpha and beta and pilot testing, we'll fold in more information as we get more feedback from people. But so cognitive task analysis is such a critical thing in our profession, and so few people talk about it. It's a shame because we force people then through our formal learning, and because we only gave them an incomplete set of content, instructional content, how to do things, how to think about things, we force them into informal learning immediately. They got to do social learning, ask their neighbor, they got to do trial and error learning. And, eventually that might be effective, but it certainly isn't efficient. So we need to cook cognitive task analysis into our processes. So all my talking with Dick Clark about this, since going back into the 2004, I wrote a book in 2021 on my approach to doing cognitive task analysis, and I borrowed the thought flow analysis phrase from Steve Villachica and Deborah Stone. They used to work together, and they wrote an article in the 80s for NSPI on thought flow analysis, and so I borrowed their term. But when I'm doing an instructional architecture project, these are my 4 phases, and then that leads to instructional development projects or you just do an instructional development project. But I don't even do cognitive task analysis in the analysis phase. I do that in the development phase in the second set of things there, the development and acquisition. I push off worrying about and I do get cognitive tasks when people tell me during the analysis phase, but I don't really focus on that. I need that when I'm doing the development and acquisition, because somebody might have said, Guy, that third area performance, yeah, drop that. So I don't want to have boiled the ocean for a cup of tea only to throw that cup of tea away because it was turned out to be not a big deal. So in my approach to all of this here, I know when my last opportunity to get the content is. And cognitive task analysis is darn difficult to get. And you get it by bringing together a group of master performers and having them work that all out and their language difference and semantics and all that. And or you do interview after interview after interview and then go back around and reconcile all the differences that you got and the contradictions. And you find out that the is the same as the. Who would have thought? And just because they say it different, and in the West Coast they call things differently than the East Coast, and you got to clear all that up here, because you got to have empathy for your learner, because they are performers first and foremost, and they've got to go back on the job and perform. And learning is a means to performance, and performance of tasks is a means to the ends of producing outputs of value that meet stakeholder requirements. So I've written with my first business partners the quality roadmap back in '94. This was our version of collapsing TQM with HPT, human performance technology, which is the means to the ends of human performance improvement. So the ASTD version, HPI, is really kind of consistent with the HPT, but NSPI and ISPI was always focused on, how do you do that? Not what you're going for, but you also need to know what you're going for, but how to actually get there. And that was the technology part of HPT, which technology meant the application of science and not digital and computer stuff. So there are many similar models to mine from the 60s through the 2000s, from Rumler, from Gilbert, two different ones that they had. Maker had his, Joe Harless had his, Donald Bullock had his, Roger Chevalier had his. And the only person alive on my list here is Carl Binder. And if you need to learn from him too, he comes more from the Gilbert school of thought and approach, and I come more from the Rumler school and approach. So if you're going to adopt and adapt things, I would just suggest looking at the stuff that he's got too, because he's good people. In the 2006 version of the HPT handbook, chapter 11 goes into 20. I got 25 pages. This is available as a PDF on my archive site. I'll show you that in a minute. But if you really are into that kind of stuff, you can go there. These are just a few of my 40-some books. I'm trying to do what Roger Kaufman did and write more than anybody can ever read. Since I've retired, I've created an archive site where I've parked a whole bunch of stuff. So I got a bunch of free resources there, and links to my YouTube channels, etc. I got 2 of those YouTube channels. I've got 174 HPT videos of HPT practitioners, because I was trying to show the diversity of HPT practitioners and their practice, because some of them are into motivation and incentives and not in instruction, and some of them are Six Sigma practitioners, and others are Lean Six Sigma practitioners. And so HPT is a big tent with a whole bunch of different expertise in it, and it takes a village, don't you know? And so this presentation, of course, is on my website, and you can download it and look at it at your leisure. If I haven't scared you away enough of this, just a month or so ago, I started a podcast because I used to put my podcast on my WordPress sites, but I don't want to pay for that anymore. So I moved everything over to Spotify, and I've got a whole bunch of podcasts, and I've got stuff already posted and scheduled to go into the middle of next year. And I recorded a podcast with Donald Clark, Plan B, that Donald Clark, over in Brighton, England, the other day, and that's I was doing these solo, and I'm going to do every other podcast with a guest about pursuing performance because that's what I'm all about here in my stage of retirement. So, bottom line, you can take a performance orientation if you're not doing it already. If you're already doing it already, congratulations. Maybe you can adopt or adapt some of what I've given you, or maybe you just got to reject the whole evening and you can never get the time back. Final Q&A. What do you got for me?
Nothing here in the room. Thanks for just sharing, highlighting, your practices and stuff. It makes us, I think the key thing is adapt and adopt. We all have a previous background, and learning from your mistakes is good. We just all laughed when you said, no, you can't use these questions because they will not work with your audience. Trust me. That was really good. But oftentimes, like, oh no, these are the questions you really have to get to. It's like, modify them and adopt and adapt. And I think that's really
yeah, Joe Harless has got the 13 smart questions, and Rumler's got, I think, 8. And, so everybody's got some of those things. So you really need to kind of source from a multitude of sources and assemble something that works for you. And of course, my questions, I'm adapting on the fly. And, but that's just what, we need to be flexible. You need to understand, I like to say that your processes have to be as rigorous as required, but as flexible as feasible, because there are some things that are just required and you got to get them. But there's other things that you got some flexibility on. And so you've got to move forward in your projects and your endeavors, embracing that. So there is no one right answer to anything. I used to love to watch the best parts of NSPI conferences back in the day was at the end of the day in the bar. And you'd get all these thought leaders in there, and they would argue and they would scream and yell at each other. And then they'd buy each other a round of drinks because it was all for fun. It was a show they were putting on for all the rest of us who had assembled around them. And that was the best learning experience in one of those conferences, better than anybody's session, because you got to see them challenge each other and defend their thinking and their language and their imagery and all of that. Anyway, so thanks for inviting me. I hope this has been helpful. If anybody's got any questions, my email is in there someplace, I'm sure, and I'm a retired guy now, and my mission in life is to help people and organizations become more performance-based. And I've just got something that's worked for me, and I'm happy to help others.
I'd like to ask you a question.
Sure.
This question is kind of the receptiveness of management to this approach from when you started to now. And the example I'll give you, I entered manufacturing in aerospace in 1984, and the world that I saw then was the organization hired experts and they hired people to do tasks. And so when there was a problem, they went to a person or an expert and said, "Go fix this." And that was pretty much the level of analysis. They got sophisticated and started hiring facilitators who everybody thought were like energy vampires. They took the energy out of discussions. So they just wrote stuff on the board that people were talking about, basically. As time went on, people got more sophisticated, but that was also the era after, Japanese cars were terrible quality, not the great quality that they have now. And it was the same in the business world. Manufacturing was primitive compared to today's practices. So how was the receptivity to what you were approaching when you started and throughout your career? And what changes did you see?
So there are this I'm overgeneralizing, of course, and I apologize for that, but manufacturing and technical audiences and managers uh, loved what I did. I'd show them examples of it and explain it to them. They go, "This is engineering, you know." And Guy, you call it architecture. Why is that? And I go, "Because that's the first label that was given to me from the Bell System Center for Technical Education." And they had this concept of curriculum architecture, so I've used that. But you could call it curriculum engineering or instructional engineering or learning engineering, which is now a phrase that's come back around again for some. But technical people get it. They understand, it's a bill of, I'm creating a bill of materials for your instruction based on what the performance requirements are. So, our Addy is like, or my Addy or anybody's Addy version of it is like a lot of my engineering clients that had, customer requirements was one of the accomplishments, the areas of performance up the front end of their process was get pin down the customer requirements, dang it, and then we can do a design or whatever our steps are, however we fragmented that. But sales and marketing people, by and large, didn't really they didn't embrace this unless they were technical sales people who were, the engineering sales kind of mindset. And so I've been in on a lot of sales calls where, what I was talking about in the examples that I showed just didn't resonate with people. And it didn't. And it's just the same reason you've got to ask the questions differently. So I'd have to learn how to do the analysis when somebody wanted to talk to me and I'm making a sales call, I would start the analysis with them because they thought, everybody knows this stuff. But then I would start getting into some of my more detailed questions. And they go, I don't have the answer to that, but I can see where that answer would be important. Maybe you do need to talk to master performers. And maybe you need to talk to more than one, but there's always been resistance to this. And so it always has been difficult. But so when I did a project with General Motors, and I trained not only General Motors people up in Detroit on my methodology, they licensed my methodology. And I taught people at Raytheon and at General Physics and at a dozen more local companies that were all part of the supplier network for General Motors in training. I forget what the client group was called at the time. But they had their own approaches to this too. So there's always resistance. And my clients, we had a very successful project that was under the gun. It won the Chairman's Quality Award in '98, and it was a high stakes project. And so my clients did a video about that project to share with other people. And they had my client's client would go around and talk to other groups in General Motors to say, I thought this was all crazy to start with. It seemed like a bunch of hooey to me. But this was a well-respected engineer. And he said, but I got to tell you, we would have never gotten to where we got to if we hadn't done what he had done here. And if you think about it, this is engineering of training. And so he would make that case and go around and tell everybody. Then they'd show this 11-minute or 9-minute video that they had made with testimonials from people involved in the project, from the client, my client's client, to the suppliers that worked at Raytheon and General Physics and one of the other companies. And so the supply side and the customer side were all talking about this project and what it had done for them. And we could make it go quick. That was the selling point. We assemble a group of master performers, and in 3 days, we can have all the analysis done. No longer 3 weeks, 3 months to do analysis. We'll get it done in 3 days. Well, I don't believe you. Let's try it. And it's because, I'm not doing analysis just in the analysis phase. I'm doing analysis and design and development too. But I could short the cycle time on all these things. And that appeals to a certain mindset of people. So people that are into data, the financial organizations, the engineering, the technical organizations, they all really kind of like this, but it was those non-technical HR types, sales and marketing types, where there was more struggle for that, unless the company was chock full of engineering with highly technical products. And then even the sales and marketing people had to learn some of that in order to exist in their organization, so they kind of could see the value of it. If I could find some way to connect them, their prior knowledge to this, if I could draw an equivalency from their world to what I was doing, then I was more successful. But sometimes it was a struggle. Sometimes I'd have to ask them to help me make those connections, and they might play along or they wouldn't. I don't, there's no real easy answer on that. So it's always been a struggle. And with the advent of e-learning in the 90s, where anybody and everybody could be an author and generate content, we didn't need instructional designers to do analysis and design all that. So you just cranked out content. Well, we did crank out content, but it wasn't instructional for the most part. It was communications or education. It was hardly ever training with practice with feedback that really honed a knowledge and or skill and a competence to perform. And so I had to make the case for that. And then I'd also have to suggest to the listeners, the clients, the prospects that you don't do this on every last thing that you could. You do this on the high stakes stuff where there's high risks and high rewards. On the medium and low stuff, let informal learning, we used to call that unstructured OJT. They'll figure it out. Leave them alone. But, focus your efforts on just the high stakes stuff. And they go, oh, okay, because most training people just seem to just push, learning, training, instruction on for everything and anything. And you had to have a business sense of that. You had to say, whether they're doing ROI or cost benefit analysis or the quality terms of cost of non-conformance and the cost of conformance, or I adapted stuff from Neil Rackham and Spin Selling. I got the chance to work with him at Motorola. But if the cost of non-conformance is worth $1 million a quarter, can't we solve this for $250,000? I mean, wouldn't that be a good thing to solve $1 million problem that's a $4 million a year problem for $250,000? And people would go, oh, yeah, okay. So one of the things I always learned also is to lead with the value of the problem. Get the problem pinned down, figure out, it's a spin selling thing, situation, problem, implications, and needs payoff. So you can get there and say, if I could solve your $4 million a year problem for $250,000, would you be interested? And they're going to go, well, hell yes. Okay, let's map out how we can go do that. Let's start the analysis right here in the room. And they can get a taste of that and see that, okay, this is different. You're not talking about knowledge and skills. You've not even mentioned those. You're talking about outputs and tasks and requirements. And it was always different. And I think a lot of my success had to do with me being given that orientation back in that first day and first week out of college. Sorry, I only have long answers.
That's okay. It was interesting. Thank you.
All right, hey, thanks a lot. If you got another question, you can reach out to Guy. He's very accessible, and again, we'll be sending out the recording and the deck to everybody who signed up for this, who's here and signed up for that tomorrow.
Yes.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for the invitation.